He stopped the wind with rocks that everyone else threw away. That is the whole story in one sentence. But one sentence cannot hold what a man carries when he builds something alone for 6 years that everyone around him calls a waste of time. One sentence cannot hold the weight of 10,000 stones, each one lifted by hand, each one fitted to the next, each one placed, while the same Kansas wind that was destroying the field behind him was trying to push him off the top of the wall he was building to stop it. So let me tell you the full story. Hamilton County sits at the far western edge of Kansas, so far west that on a clear day you can see the line of Colorado on the horizon 30 miles away. The land is flat, the way a lake is flat, with nothing to interrupt the surface for as far as the eye can travel in any direction. The elevation runs around 3,400 feet. The annual rainfall averages 17 inches in a good year and considerably less in a bad one. And then there is the wind. In most parts of America, wind is weather. It comes on certain days and is gone by evening. You notice it when it blows your hat off in a parking lot and forget about it before you reach the door. In western Kansas, wind is not weather. Wind is geography. It is as permanent as the soil beneath your feet, as constant as the flatness of the land, as reliable as the fact of the horizon. It comes off the Colorado plains and crosses the western third of Kansas without encountering a single thing tall enough to slow it down. No mountains, no forests, no hills worth naming. Just open prairie and wind that never stops at a steady 25 miles per hour and sometimes considerably more. And what that wind does to bare agricultural soil is the foundation of everything that follows. When wind blows across exposed ground, it picks up particles. The very finest particles, the clay and silt that constitute the most fertile fraction of good topsoil, go airborne and can travel hundreds of miles. You have seen the photographs from the 1930s, the walls of brown air rolling across the plains, like something biblical. The sky turned black at noon, the houses half buried in drifted soil. That was wind erosion at its most dramatic. But wind erosion does not have to be dramatic to be devastating. On any windy day in Hamilton County, and there were 120 of them each year, a farmer could lose a fraction of an inch of topsoil, not enough to see, not enough to measure with a ruler, just enough that over 10 years a field that had started with 12 inches of black topsoil was down to 8, then 6, then 5. 5 inches of topsoil will grow a crop, but it will not grow the crop that 12 inches grows. It will not hold moisture the way 12 inches holds moisture. It will not support the microbial life that healthy soil requires. And every inch that goes does not come back in a season or a decade or a lifetime. It takes nature approximately 500 years to build a single inch of topsoil through the accumulation of organic matter and the work of soil organisms and the patient chemistry of weathering stone. The wind can remove that inch in 5 years on unprotected ground in western Kansas. The federal government had understood this since the Dust Bowl, after the catastrophe of the 1930s, when an entire generation of plains farmers watched their soil blow to the Atlantic Ocean. Washington had planted 220 million trees across the Great Plains in a massive program called the Shelter Belt. Rows of trees designed to break the wind and protect the soil behind them. The program had worked in the areas where the trees survived, but by 1962, many of those original shelter belts were dying. They were 30 years old, weakened by drought and disease, and the new generation of farmers was more interested in removing tree rows to make room for the wider turning radius of center pivot irrigation equipment than in planting new ones. In Hamilton County, the county extension agent, a man named Roger Voss, gave the same speech every year at the annual conservation meeting in Syracuse. Plant shelter belts. Trees are your best defense against wind erosion. Red cedar, Austrian pine, Rocky Mountain juniper. The Kansas Forest Service will supply the seedlings at low cost. Plant a row on your western boundary and protect your soil. And every year the farmers gave him the same answer. Roger, trees take 20 years to grow tall enough to matter. 20 years, I need help now, not in a generation. They were not wrong. A freshly planted shelter belt is about as useful as a windbreak as a line of fence posts. It takes 15 to 20 years for a planted tree row to reach the height and density required to significantly reduce wind speed across a field. For a farmer whose topsoil was already thinning, whose yields were already declining, 20 years was not a timeline, it was a surrender. So the farmers of Hamilton County did what Great Plains farmers had been doing for 100 years. They farmed anyway. They accepted the wind and the erosion as a cost of doing business, and hoped that this year would not be worse than last year. They planted into diminishing soil and harvested diminishing yields and told themselves that things would improve when the rain came back or the wind slowed down or something changed that was beyond their control. Every farmer in Hamilton County had made their peace with this. Every farmer except Dellard Pruin. Dellard was 44 years old in the spring of 1962. And he had been farming 320 acres on the western edge of Hamilton County since 1946, the year he came home from the Navy. He had married Helen Fosberg the following year and taken over the farm that her father had worked since before either of them was born. 16 years of farming the same ground, and every one of those 16 years, the wind had taken a little more of what he was trying to keep. Dellard's farm was in the worst possible position for wind erosion in Hamilton County. It sat on the western edge of the county, the absolute westernmost reach of cultivated agricultural land before the terrain transitioned to open range and short grass prairie running uninterrupted to the Colorado Rockies 80 miles to the west. The wind that reached Dellard's fields had been building speed since it came off the mountains. By the time it crossed his western fence line, it had been traveling across unobstructed flat ground for most of a day, and it hit his topsoil with the accumulated force of everything it had been doing since dawn. His yields showed what 16 years of that looked like. In 1962, Dellard's wheat averaged 21 bushels per acre. The county average was 34. His grain sorghum averaged 42 bushels. The county average was 58. He was farming the same soil in the same climate with the same seed varieties and the same management practices as his neighbors on every side, and he was getting roughly 60% of what they were getting. Not because he was farming badly, because the wind was farming his topsoil faster than the rain, and the seasons could rebuild it. The west quarter of his farm was the worst. 160 acres that sat fully exposed to the Colorado wind with nothing between them and the mountains. The topsoil on that quarter had started at 12 inches when Dellard's father-in-law had first broken the native sod decades earlier. By 1962, it was down to 5 inches in the most exposed sections. 5 inches of topsoil above the pale calcite subsoil that grew almost nothing and held even less moisture. Roger Voss had been telling Dellard to plant a shelter belt since 1955. He had been telling it with the patient insistence of a man who believes in what he is recommending and knows that the recommendation is correct and simply cannot understand why it is not being followed. In the spring of 1962, he came to Dellard's farm in April for what had become an annual conversation. He found Dellard at the west edge of the farm, standing at the boundary fence line, looking west across the open range toward Colorado. The wind was blowing at maybe 30 miles per hour that morning, and even as they stood there, Dellard could see the thin brownish haze at ground level that meant topsoil was moving across his field and would be in Oklahoma by nightfall. Roger talked about the shelter belt program again. Red cedar along the western boundary, Rocky Mountain juniper for the corners. The state nursery had good seedlings available at reasonable cost. Dellard listened. He had listened to this every year for 7 years. When Roger finished, Dellard said the thing he had been calculating in his head for the better part of a decade. I don't have 20 years, he said. My soil doesn't have 20 years. He pointed to the west quarter, to the pale exposed subsoil showing through the thin dark topsoil at the most eroded sections, to the places where the wind had already won. At the rate that ground is losing topsoil, he said, I'll be farming subsoil before those trees are tall enough to break the wind, even if I planted tomorrow. Roger looked at the field. He could not argue with what Dellard was showing him. The numbers were visible in the pale color of the exposed sections, in the way the wind picked up loose particles even now and carried them east in a thin horizontal stream. Then what's your plan? Roger said. Dellard turned away from the field and walked to the corner of the property where the fence met the road. At that corner, as at every corner and fence line on every farm in Hamilton County, there was a pile of rocks, field stones that he had pulled from the soil during spring tillage over 16 years of farming, limestone and flint and sandstone and granite, everything that the freeze-thaw cycle of Kansas winters pushed to the surface each spring, ready to break plow blades and jam combine headers and puncture tractor tires if left in the field. Every farmer in Hamilton County pulled these rocks every spring. They went to the fence line, to the gully at the low end of the field, to the gravel pit east of Syracuse, where the county road crew would eventually haul them for road base. They were waste. They were the thing you removed before you could do the actual work of farming. Dellard pointed at the rock pile. Those he said. Roger Voss looked at the rocks. Then he looked at Dellard. Then he looked at the rocks again. You want to build a windbreak out of rocks, Roger said. I want to build a wall, Dellard said. 4 feet high along my entire western boundary. Half a mile. Roger was a patient man. Extension agents in western Kansas had to be. They spent their working lives delivering advice that farmers often could not afford to follow, and navigating between the demands of federal programs and the realities of agricultural economics in a marginal climate. His patience had limits. Dellard, he said, a stone wall is not a recognized soil conservation practice. There is no research supporting stone walls as windbreaks in Great Plains agriculture. The Soil Conservation Service recommends tree shelter belts, grass filter strips, and contour strip cropping. Nobody builds walls. Nobody in Kansas, Dellard said. But they build them in Scotland. They build them in Ireland. They have been building them in New England for 300 years. The wind blows in those places too. Those are different climates, different soils, different farming systems, Roger said. Wind is wind, Roger. A 4-foot wall breaks the wind the same way in Kansas as it does in Scotland. Physics doesn't care about the zip code. Roger looked at the rocks. He looked at the field. He looked at Dellard. He wrote something in his field notebook. Then he closed the notebook, said he would check back in the fall, and drove away toward his next appointment. The notation in his notebook, which he would later remember with some embarrassment, was Pruin Stone Wall Proposal. Not a recognized practice, not recommended. Now let me tell you about Burl Haxton, because he is the other voice in this story, and you need to understand what kind of man he was before you understand what he said. Burl Haxton was 51 years old in 1962 and had owned the John Deere dealership in Syracuse for the previous 18 years. He was a large man with a large personality to match the kind of man who fills a room when he enters it, and who has strong opinions about everything within his field of knowledge and most things outside of it. In Hamilton County in 1962, the John Deere dealership was the gravitational center of agricultural commerce. If you wanted to know what a farmer should be doing with his operation, the place to ask was the showroom in Syracuse, where the newest equipment sat in gleaming rows, and where the conversation on Saturday mornings covered everything from corn prices to county politics to the personal decisions of every farmer within 30 miles. Burl had been commenting on Dellard Pruin's farming operation for most of the 16 years Dellard had been in the county. His opinion was not malicious. It was something that is sometimes harder to argue with than malice, because malice at least has the decency to acknowledge that it is taking a position. Burl's opinion was the confident consensus of a man who considers himself to be speaking plain common sense, and who has enough social standing to make his common sense into the room's common sense by the force of his personality. The news of Dillard's plan reached the co-op in Syracuse within a week of Roger Voss's visit to the farm. Roger had not meant to spread it. He had mentioned it to one person in the context of a conversation about difficult farmers and unusual ideas, and the information had traveled from there at the speed that agricultural community information always travels, which is faster than you expect and more thoroughly than you intend. Burl heard it on a Saturday morning when Dillard's name came up in the group gathered around the coffee machine. He listened to the description of the plan. A stone wall 4 feet high, half a mile long along the western boundary of the Pruin farm, built from the field rocks that Dellard had been pulling out of his soil for 16 years. No mortar, no machinery, just stones laid by hand. When the description was finished, Burl set his coffee cup down on the counter with the deliberate care of a man preparing to say something that deserves a moment of setup. Dellard Pruin is going back to the Stone Age, he said. He paused, looking around the room to make sure he had the audience he expected. Next thing you know, he'll be digging a moat and raising the drawbridge. The room laughed. Burl was good at this, the public performance of certainty, the ease of the man who knows that what he is about to say will land the way he intends it to land. He continued in the vein he had established. Somebody should remind Dellard that we have tractors now, we have center pivots, we have herbicides and fertilizers and modern farming science. We don't need to go back to the medieval period to solve a wind problem. We need to invest in the right equipment and the right techniques. He looked around the room. That wall is going to be a pile of rocks in a field, nothing more. The name stuck. For the better part of the next decade, Dellard Pruin was the rock man of Hamilton County. His wall was the medieval wall. His plan was the joke that Burl refreshed every Saturday morning when new people came into the co-op and the subject came up. Dellard knew about it. Small county. Word traveled. He knew what Burl was saying, and he knew the room was laughing. He did not go to the co-op on Saturday mornings for a while. Let me tell you about the night before he started building, because this is the moment that this story turns on. The evening of April 16th, 1962. Dellard sat at the kitchen table after supper with a piece of paper in front of him. He had drawn a rough sketch of his western boundary, the fence line running north from the county road for half a mile before turning east at the section corner. Along that line he had drawn a rectangle representing the wall he planned to build, 4 feet high, 18 inches wide at the base, half a mile from end to end. He had done the calculations. The volume of stone required, the approximate weight of that stone, which he estimated at 150 tons. The time required based on how fast he could move and place material while working alone before and after the regular farm work. 6 years. If everything went reasonably well and he could maintain the pace he planned, the wall would be finished in 6 years. Helen came in from the other room and saw the sketch on the table. She sat across from him and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Helen was 42 years old and had been watching this farm lose ground to the wind for the same 16 years Dellard had been farming it, and she understood the situation with the completeness of a woman who has kept the books and walked the fields and knows every inch of what is at stake. She asked the question that anyone who loved the man would ask. What if it doesn't work? He did not answer immediately. He looked out the kitchen window at the west quarter, which was dark now, the field invisible in the April night, except for the silhouette of the fence line against the slightly lighter horizon. He had been thinking about this for years, not just since Roger Voss's last visit, and not just since the morning he had stood at the fence corner looking at the rocks, and had the idea that had been forming slowly in the back of his mind for longer than he could precisely identify. He had been thinking about the wind and the walls since the first time he had driven east of his farm and noticed the way his neighbor's wheat stood taller in the rows that happened to be sheltered by an equipment shed, the way the snow drifted on the downwind side of every vertical surface on the farm, the way even a stacked hay bale left a patch of calm behind it for 20 feet downwind. He had been watching wind hit vertical surfaces for 16 years. He had watched it happen against the barn wall and the grain bin and the equipment shed and every fence post on the property. Every vertical surface created a zone of relative calm on the downwind side. The bigger the surface, the larger the zone. The more massive the surface, the more energy the wind dissipated against it. A wall was a surface. A long wall was a long surface. A wall made of 150 tons of stone was a massive surface. Then I've spent 6 years moving rocks from one place to another, he said finally. But the rocks have to go somewhere. Every spring I pull them out of the field and pile them at the fence line. They've been piling up for 16 years. They have to go somewhere. He looked at the sketch on the table. Might as well try. It was not a declaration. It was not the confident statement of a man who knows he is right. It was something quieter than that, the decision of a man who has looked at his available options and determined that the one everyone is laughing at is still the best one on the table. The soil was thinning. The yields were declining. The trees would take 20 years. The government programs were not designed for his situation. The equipment dealer was selling center pivots for fields with enough topsoil to irrigate, and Dellard's worst ground would have no topsoil left by the time those pivots paid for themselves. The rocks were there. They had always been there. They were the one material on the farm that existed in abundance and cost nothing because everyone considered them waste and was glad to be rid of them. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and took his coffee cup to refill it, and when she set it back down, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, which was Helen's way of saying the things she did not say out loud, and went to bed. Dellard sat at the table for another hour with the sketch in front of him. He was not revising the plan. The plan was what it was. He was sitting with the weight of what he had decided, letting it settle, preparing himself for the work ahead. He was up at 4:30 the next morning. He did his regular chores first, fed the cattle, checked the equipment, did the barn work in the pre-dawn dark, the same way he did it every morning. Then at 6 o'clock he loaded the farm truck with the hand tools he had prepared: a crowbar, a flat spade, a level, a string line, and drove to the southwest corner of the property. Hamilton County sits on what geologists call the High Plains surface, a layer of ancient sediment deposited by rivers flowing east from the Rocky Mountains over millions of years. Mixed into this sediment are stones of every size and composition: limestone from Cretaceous seabeds, flint from chalky deposits, granite pieces carried by ancient glacial drift sandstone laid down in river channels. The freeze-thaw cycle of Kansas winters, the expansion and contraction of soil through repeated freezing and thawing, pushes these stones upward through the soil each year, the way bread dough pushes raisins to the top when it rises. Every spring Dellard had walked his fields and picked up what the winter had delivered. He had used a stone boat, a flat sled dragged behind the farm-all, to carry loads of rock to the fence lines. 16 years of picking had produced at every fence line on the property piles of stone that had been accumulating since before Dellard arrived, and had grown larger every season. At the southwest corner where the western boundary met the county road, the pile was substantial enough that you could see it from the road as a low gray mound, the unsorted geological inventory of 160 acres of Kansas farmland. Dellard walked to the pile and stood beside it. He had never read a book about dry-stacked stone construction. He had not taken a course or studied with anyone who knew the technique. What he had was 16 years of handling thousands of individual rocks and developing, in the way that a farmer develops knowledge about the materials he works, with an understanding of how stones related to each other, which ones were flat enough to serve as a stable base, which ones had surfaces that could be made to interlock with the surfaces of adjacent stones, which shapes would bridge gaps and which would create gaps, how the weight of stones above stabilized the stones below. He crouched down beside the pile and began to sort. The first stone he placed was a flat piece of limestone, roughly the size and shape of a large dictionary. He set it at the corner of his western fence line, with its longest dimension running north parallel to the fence and its flattest face up. He set a second stone beside it, overlapping slightly so that no vertical joint ran continuously from bottom to top. He placed a third and a fourth. This was the beginning of the wall. He worked for 2 hours that morning before the farm work required his attention. In 2 hours he had placed approximately 8 feet of the base course. 8 feet of roughly half a mile required. He went to do his regular work. That evening after supper he went back and worked for another 2 hours by the light of the truck which he had parked at the fence line with the headlights facing the work. He added another 6 feet. He did this every day. By the end of April he had 40 feet of wall 2 courses high running north from the county road. By the end of May he had 90 feet. By the end of the first summer, when the harvest work and the heat of July and August had reduced his available time to early mornings and late evenings, he had completed approximately 200 feet. The work became known. A farming operation has no privacy because its fields are visible from the roads, and the roads are traveled by people who know what they are looking at. By midsummer, everyone in the western part of the county had driven past the southwest corner of the Pruin farm and seen the gray stone structure taking shape along the fence line. The co-op consensus held that it would not last the first winter. Dry stacked stone without mortar, the argument went, would be heaved apart by the frost or blown over by the first serious wind, or simply collapse under its own weight by spring. This prediction was delivered with the confidence of people who had not built anything from stone, but were certain they understood why stone walls failed. Burl Haxton refined his position. His original characterization of the wall as medieval and Dellard as the rock man had achieved enough circulation that he no longer needed to introduce the joke. He only needed to update it. He told anyone who came into the dealership that he had heard Dellard was hiring a court jester and a blacksmith to go with the castle. He told people that he expected to see Dellard arrive at the elevator on horseback by harvest. He said these things with the ease of a man who has found a reliable source of entertainment and intends to use it until the entertainment runs out. The entertainment Burl assumed would run out when the wall collapsed or Dellard gave up or the first winter proved what everyone already knew. What Burl did not know, what no one in the co-op knew, was the thing that Dellard had spent 16 years observing on his own farm. Every vertical surface creates a calm zone on the downwind side. He had watched it against the barn. He had watched it against the grain bin. He had watched it in miniature against every fence post and every stacked hay bale and every piece of equipment left in the field overnight. The calm zone extended downwind at a distance proportional to the height of the vertical surface. A 4-foot object created calm for 40 to 60 feet on the downwind side under normal conditions. But Dellard had also noticed something that the standard formula did not quite capture. The grain bin, which was round and hollow, deflected the wind cleanly. The barn, which was solid and massive, did something different. Where the grain bin created turbulence on the downwind side as the deflected air reattached to the ground and swirled, the barn created a zone of genuine calm that extended farther and was more stable. The difference was mass. A wall made of 150 tons of stone was not going to deflect the wind the way a fence post deflected it. It was going to absorb the wind the way a hillside absorbs a river. The energy would have to go somewhere, and some of it would go over the top and around the ends, but a significant portion of it would enter the gaps between the stones and dissipate inside the structure, converted from kinetic energy to heat by friction against 150 tons of limestone and flint and granite. He had not read this in a textbook. He had not derived it from any formula. He had watched wind hit heavy objects for 16 years and paid attention to what he saw, and what he had seen was that mass was the variable that everyone was ignoring. Roger Voss thought about height. Trees were tall. A 4-foot wall was short. Therefore, trees were better. Burl Haxton thought about technology. Center pivots and herbicides were modern. Stone walls were ancient. Therefore, center pivots were better. Neither of them was thinking about mass. Dellard Pruin had been thinking about Mass since the day he had stood beside his grain bin in a 40-mile-per-hour wind and noticed that the calm zone on the downwind side of the heavy concrete bin extended twice as far as the calm zone on the downwind side of his wooden equipment shed, even though the two structures were nearly the same height. Mass, not height, that was the variable. He did not tell this to Roger. He did not explain it to Burl. He went back to the southwest corner of his property every morning at first light and every evening after supper and added stone to a wall that he intended to run for half a mile along the western edge of his farm. By October of 1962, the wall was 400 feet long. The Kansas winter came on in November, with the particular severity of a high plains winter, the kind that drops the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon and freezes the ground to depth in a week. The farmers of Hamilton County watched Dellard's stone wall with the attention of people waiting for a prediction to come true. The wall stood through November. It stood through December. The freeze-thaw cycle that was supposed to heave it apart had done nothing to it by January because the dry stacked construction, which had no mortar to crack and no rigid connections to fail, simply moved slightly with the frost and settled back with the thaw, each stone finding its new position in the slight adjustment of the pile as the ground beneath it expanded and contracted. By spring the wall was exactly where it had been in October, 400 feet of gray limestone and flint running north from the county road along the western fence line of the Pruin farm. Dellard walked it in March after the frost was out of the ground and checked every section. He found two places where individual stones had shifted enough to create gaps in the face of the wall. He spent an afternoon resetting them. He added stones to the top course in 3 sections where the winter had settled the structure slightly below the intended 4-foot height. Then he went back to the farm work that April demanded, and when the farm work was done in the evenings, he went back to the wall and continued north. 400 feet done, 2,240 feet to go. In the spring of 1963, Dellard noticed something in his wheat. The rows closest to the completed section of wall within about 60 feet of the structure on the east side were standing taller than the rows farther away, not dramatically taller. About 2 inches at the heading stage, which is the stage when the plant's final height is most visible and most meaningful. 2 inches in heading stage wheat means more moisture in the root zone during the critical growth period. It means less evaporation stress during the weeks when the plant is setting grain. It means better photosynthesis on the days when the wind is strong enough to cause physical damage to unprotected plants, the lodging and leaf tearing that reduces yield potential even without visible destruction. 2 inches, 400 feet of wall. First spring. Dellard measured the rows with a folding rule. He wrote the numbers in the farm notebook he kept in the desk in the kitchen office in the same section where he recorded his yields and his input costs and his rainfall totals. He did not tell Roger Voss. He did not mention it at the elevator. He did not go to the co-op on Saturday morning and walk up to Burl Haxton and say anything at all. He went back to the wall after supper and laid more stone. The second year was harder than the first. Not because the work was harder exactly. The work was the same work it had always been, stone on stone, morning and evening, weekends, without break. Dellard had found his pace in the first year, and he understood now what his body could sustain across a full farming season, while also doing everything else that 320 acres required. He understood the rhythm of it, the pre-dawn hours at the wall before the heat built the evening hours by truck light, after the day's field work was done, the long Saturdays when he could give the wall most of the day. The second year was harder because the second year was when doubt has its best opportunity. In the first year, the work had the momentum of a new thing, the particular forward energy of a decision just made and a plan just begun. There are no questions in the first months of a project-only action. The wall went from nothing to 400 feet, and 400 feet of stone was visibly something, visibly progress, visibly the beginning of an argument that Dillard was making to the wind and to the county and to himself. By the second year, the wall was a fact that everyone had absorbed and dismissed. The co-op had worked through its jokes and arrived at the comfortable position of ignoring the whole matter. Burl Haxton had moved on to other subjects. Roger Voss had filed the stone wall under unusual farmer decisions and was focusing his attention on the new conservation tillage practices coming out of the Extension Service. The wall was no longer interesting to anyone in Hamilton County except the man building it. And the man building it was spending his evenings on a fence line in the wind, moving stones from one place to another while his west quarter lost another fraction of an inch of topsoil every time the wind exceeded 30 miles an hour. In the spring of 1963, he had seen the 2-inch height advantage in the wheat rows nearest the wall. He had measured it and recorded it and said nothing. But 2 inches in wheat rows along 400 feet of a half-mile boundary was not proof. It was suggestion. It was a signal that could be explained by soil variation or irrigation pattern or a dozen other variables that had nothing to do with the wall at all. To make it proof, Dillard needed the full wall, the entire half-mile of protected boundary, producing results that could not be attributed to anything except what he had built. He had 400 feet. He needed 2,640. He added 500 feet in 1963, 900 feet total by the end of that year, just over a third of the way. The farm work of 1963 was hard. The rain came late in the spring, and the wheat establishment was poor on all of his ground, protected and unprotected both. His yields that year were down across the board, which meant the comparison between the wall-protected section and the unprotected section was less clear than it had been the previous year. The signal was still there if you measured carefully, but it was buried in the noise of a difficult season. This is the year that tests a man with a long plan, when the short-term results are ambiguous and the endpoint is still years away, and the work is exactly as hard as it has always been, and the people around you have stopped laughing only because they have stopped paying attention. This is when the doubt comes in, not dramatically, not as a crisis, but quietly, the way cold air comes in under a door, finding the gaps. Dillard felt it. He would not have called it doubt exactly. He would have called it arithmetic. In the evenings when he was too tired to go to the wall, which happened more in 1963 than it had in 1962, he would sit at the kitchen table and do the arithmetic of what he had done against what he needed to do. 900 feet against 2,640. 3 years of work against 3 more years of work at minimum. His topsoil, which was still thinning on the unprotected sections of the west quarter, was not waiting for him to finish. He went to the wall anyway. Now let me tell you about the winter of 1964, because the winter of 1964 is when the story came closest to ending differently. January of that year brought the worst weather Hamilton County had seen in a decade. A series of Arctic systems moved through the region in quick succession, each one dropping temperatures below zero and driving winds that gusted to 50 miles per hour on the worst nights. The ground froze hard and fast, and the frost went deeper than usual, reaching down into the soil column past the point where the stones in Dillard's wall had their foundation. In the second week of February, a storm came through that was particularly severe. It started with sleet, which coated every surface with a layer of ice, and then the temperature dropped and the wind came up, and the ice-coated landscape was subjected to a sustained blow that lasted 2 days. On the morning of the 14th, when the wind finally dropped enough to go outside without risk, Dillard drove his truck down the farm lane to the wall. 30 feet of it had come down. Not collapsed exactly. The stones had not fallen outward or inward. They had shifted, each one moving a fraction of an inch under the combined force of the frost heave from below and the ice load from above and the wind pressure from the west, and the cumulative effect of those small movements across 30 feet of wall had been enough to bring the top courses off and leave a section of the structure at roughly half its intended height, with the displaced stones scattered across the ground on both sides. 30 feet. 3 weeks of his work, maybe 4, given the pace he had been managing in the second year. Dillard stood at the damaged section for a long time. He was not counting the hours. He was not making calculations. He was standing in the February cold, looking at the stones on the ground and feeling the weight of what that represented, not just the time that would be required to rebuild the fallen section, but the larger question that the fallen section made it harder to avoid. The question was whether the wall could survive the conditions it was meant to survive in. Not just stand in calm weather, stand in Kansas weather, which was not calm weather, which was the kind of weather that had been removing his topsoil for 16 years, and was not going to become gentler because he had put some stones in front of it. If a storm like this one could bring down 30 feet of wall in a night, what would a worse storm do? What would 5 winters do? What would happen when the wall that was supposed to protect his soil for decades turned out to be a temporary structure that required constant rebuilding? He was standing there with these thoughts when he heard a vehicle on the county road. Burl Haxton's truck came from the east, moving at road speed, and as it passed the section of the Pruin farm where the wall ran along the western fence line, it slowed. Dillard could see it through the windshield without being able to see the face behind it, but he knew the truck knew it the way everyone in Hamilton County knew everyone else's vehicle, and he could imagine well enough what Burl was seeing from the road: the fallen section, the scattered stones, the man standing beside them in the February cold. The truck slowed almost to a stop. It stayed there for a moment at the edge of Dillard's peripheral vision, long enough to take in what there was to take in. Then it moved on and disappeared around the curve of the road heading toward Syracuse. Burl did not stop. He did not get out. He did not come down the farm lane to say anything, and Dillard told himself that the absence of a visit was neither confirmation nor disconfirmation of anything. But standing there in the cold with 30 feet of his wall on the ground, he felt the weight of the other man's observation in a way that had nothing to do with Burl specifically, and everything to do with what Burl represented, which was the collected opinion of everyone who had told Dillard that this would not work. He drove back to the house. He ate breakfast, he did the morning chores, he spent the middle of the day doing the routine maintenance work that February on a Kansas farm requires: the equipment checks and the fence inspections and the seed inventory for the coming spring. At 4:30 in the afternoon, when the winter light was already going and the temperature was dropping again towards single digits, Dillard drove back to the wall. He worked until it was too dark to see. He had rebuilt approximately 8 feet of the fallen section. He went home, ate supper, and went to bed. He was at the wall at first light the next morning. By the end of that week, the 30-foot section was rebuilt. When he rebuilt it, he paid particular attention to the way the individual stones were interlocked across the face, spending more time on each placement than he had during the original construction. fitting the angular pieces more carefully against each other, so that there were fewer planes of weakness running continuously through the width of the wall. The rebuilt section was better than what it replaced. He had learned something from the failure, the way you learn things from failures that you cannot learn from successes, which is where exactly the weakness was and what exactly was required to address it. The wall that failed had been built the way Dillard had been building from the beginning, which was the way that seemed most natural to a man who had not been taught the technique but was figuring it out from first principles. The rebuilt section was built the way a man builds after he has studied his own failure and understood specifically what had given way. He continued north. In 1964, he added 600 feet, 1,500 feet total by the end of the year, more than half. The summer of 1964 also brought one of Burl Haxton's more memorable co-op performances. In July, a soil conservation specialist from the Kansas State Extension Service came through Hamilton County on a field tour visiting several farms to discuss erosion control practices. Burl managed to encounter this specialist at the co-op on the day of his visit and steered the conversation in the way that Burl steered most co-op conversations toward the subject he wanted to address. He asked the specialist in front of a room of farmers whether stone walls were a recognized soil conservation practice in Great Plains agriculture. The specialist said that to his knowledge, no. The established practices were tree shelter belts, grass filter strips, and strip cropping. He was not aware of any research literature on stone windbreaks in the region. Burl received this answer with the satisfaction of a man who has arranged for confirmation of a position he has held for 3 years. Someone in the room mentioned Dillard's Wall. The specialist said he would be interested to have a look at it if time permitted. He drove past the Pruin farm on his way out of the county. He slowed at the section of wall visible from the road, which by that point was about 1,500 feet of gray stone running north along the western fence line. He did not stop. He continued east toward the next county on his itinerary. He told a colleague at the Extension Service later that it was an unusual thing to see in Hamilton County. He did not say whether he thought it was working. Dillard knew the specialist had driven past. Word of the visit reached him before the day was out. He did not change what he was doing. He went to the wall that evening and added stone to the next section. In 1965, he added 500 feet. 2,000 feet total. The summer of 1965 was the summer when the difference became visible from the county road. Not to everyone, and not obviously the way a billboard is obvious. Visible to people who were paying attention, who drove past often enough to have a baseline comparison in memory, who farmed themselves and knew what wheat in Hamilton County was supposed to look like in June. The south half of Dillard's west quarter, the section behind the completed 2,000 feet of wall, was a different shade of green from the north half, which was still unprotected. Darker, denser, taller in the way that wheat is taller when the root zone has held more moisture through the critical growth period. People at the elevator noticed. People at the co-op noticed. The specific response was not belief exactly. It was the more careful formulation of people who are seeing something they do not yet have an explanation for. Something looks different about Dillard's west half, someone would say. Probably a soil difference, someone else would say. Or he is irrigating more on that side. Or the seed variety's different. Seed. They were not wrong to look for alternative explanations. A good farmer does not accept a single season's observation as proof of a principle. But several of them drove past the farm more deliberately in the last weeks before harvest. and what they saw was consistent with what they had noticed in June. The protected section was standing better. The heads were fuller. The color through harvest was more even. No one asked Dellard about it directly because asking would have required acknowledging that they had been watching and that what they saw was worth noting. Dellard said nothing. He continued building. Now let me tell you about the specific quality of the work in those middle years, because the quality of the work is where the character of the man is most visible. Dry stacked stone construction is not a technically complicated process. There is no specialized knowledge required, no specific training, no tool that cannot be improvised or replaced. You select a stone, you carry it to the wall, you find the place where it fits, you set it down. If it does not fit you, try it in a different orientation, or you exchange it for a different stone. When you have placed a stone that satisfies you, you place the next one. What makes it difficult is not the technique, it is the attention. Every stone in a dry stacked wall is different from every other stone. Limestone splits along bedding planes and has flat faces and predictable fracture patterns. Flint is dense and angular and locks together at its corners in ways that limestone does not. Sandstone is soft enough to dress with a hammer blow and can be shaped to fit a gap that no available stone would otherwise fill. Granite is irregular and rounded and requires the most patience to place well because its curved surfaces do not offer the purchase that flat surfaces do. Dellard had been handling these materials for 16 years. He knew them the way a woodworker knows the grain of different species, not abstractly, but in his hands, in the feel of the weight and the edge and the surface as he lifted and turned and placed each piece. He developed over the 6 years of the wall a practice that he did not name and did not think of as a technique, but that shaped the quality of every foot he built. Before placing any stone, he turned it completely in his hands, looking at all of its faces and angles, holding it in the various orientations it might occupy in the wall, before settling on the one that offered the best bearing surface below and the best locking faces on the sides. This rotation took perhaps 10 seconds per stone. Over 10,000 stones, it was a significant investment of time. But it was also the reason that the wall Dellard built was not just a pile of stones, but a structure, something that held together because of how it was put together rather than just because it was heavy. He worked alone for most of the construction. Helen came to the wall on some Saturdays and helped move stone from the piles at the fence line to the section under construction, which reduced the carrying time and allowed him to maintain the placing pace without interrupting it to go back for material. She did not offer opinions about the construction. She brought water and left it at the base of the wall and went back to her part of the work. The quality of her help was in its uncomplicated usefulness. Neighbors allowed him to take rocks from their fence lines and field piles which they were glad to have removed regardless of what he did with them. By the later years of the construction, Dellard was hauling stone from fence lines 2 and 3 miles from his own property, loading the farm truck with material that other farmers had been accumulating for years and that had no destination before Dellard arrived to give it one. The stone that built the Pruin Wall came from the fields of 11 different farms in the western part of Hamilton County. In 1966, Dellard added 400 feet to the wall, 2,400 feet total, one more season. By the summer of 1966, the evidence in the wheat was no longer deniable to anyone who was willing to look directly at it rather than through the filter of what they expected to see. The south portion of the west quarter behind the completed wall was producing a stand that was visibly, measurably different from both the unprotected north portion of the same quarter and from the county average for similar ground. Dellard was keeping records. He had been keeping records since the first season, the careful notebook entries of a man who trusts what he can measure more than what he can feel. The height differential between protected and unprotected rose in his own field. The soil moisture readings he was taking with a simple probe at 10-foot intervals across the field, comparing the moisture content near the wall to the moisture content 200 feet away on the unprotected side. The yield records which he tracked by section so that he could compare the protected and unprotected portions of the same quarter directly. The numbers were building in the direction he had hoped they would build, but he kept them to himself. This was not strategic silence. It was not an attempt to create a dramatic reveal. It was simply Dellard's way of operating, which was to let the work speak when the work was ready to speak and the work was not ready yet. He had 2/3 of a wall. He needed the full wall before any number he could produce meant anything that could not be argued away by someone who wanted to argue. By this time, the county had largely forgotten that the wall was a joke. The joke requires a shared certainty that the thing being mocked will fail, and by 1966 that certainty was no longer shared. Burl Haxton still made his occasional references to Dellard the Rockman, but they lacked the ease in the room's response that the early years had provided. The audience had been driving past the west quarter of the Pruen farm for 4 years, and had seen what was growing behind the wall, and even people who were not ready to say the wall was responsible for what they saw were not ready to laugh at it anymore either. Burl felt this. He was a man with a salesman's sensitivity to the mood of a room, and he could tell when a line that used to land well was landing with a different quality. He was not wrong about much in the realm of agricultural equipment and the economics of plains farming. It was becoming increasingly possible that he was wrong about this. He did not say this aloud. He did not retract anything. But he stopped bringing up the subject on Saturday mornings, which in its own way was a kind of statement. In the fall of 1966, on a Saturday afternoon in October when the harvest was in and the farm work had slowed to the maintenance pace of late autumn, Dellard drove his truck along the length of the wall from south to north the full 2,400 feet and walked the entire structure on foot. He was looking at it the way he looked at everything on the farm at the end of a season, with the comprehensive attention of a man taking inventory before winter. He found 7 sections that needed attention before the frost came, stones that had settled unevenly under the summer's thermal expansion and contraction. A section near the northern end where a vehicle had cut too close to the fence line and clipped the base course, dislodging 2 foundation stones. A long section in the middle where the top course had shifted slightly under what looked like the effects of sustained wind pressure, the very force the wall was designed to resist, leaving its signature on the structure that resisted it. He spent 3 weekends repairing what needed repairing. Then he let the wall go into winter. In the spring of 1967, he started again. The final 240 feet of the wall ran north from the 2,400-foot mark to the section corner at the top of the western boundary. This was the last section, and Dellard knew it was the last section, and there was something in that knowledge that changed the quality of the work in ways he would not have been able to articulate precisely. He did not rush it. He had been doing this for 5 years, and he knew that rushing was the thing that made work that needed to last look like work that would not last. He placed the last section with the same attention he had brought to the first stones in April of 1962. On a Saturday in October of 1967 in the late afternoon when the light was going flat and gold across the Kansas prairie, Dellard Pruin placed the last stone on the last course of the last section of the wall. He stepped back from the work and looked north along the full half-mile of stone 2,640 feet from the county road to the section corner 4 feet high and 18 inches wide at the base, running along the western fence line of his property in a continuous gray line that was not straight, because the ground it followed was not perfectly straight, curving slightly where the grade dipped and rising with the slight elevation change near the northern end. He looked at it for a while. The wind was blowing out of the west, as it almost always was, at maybe 20 miles an hour, and he could feel it on the back of his neck on the upwind side of the wall, and almost not feel it at all when he stepped around to the east face and stood in the shelter the wall created. The wheat stubble in the west quarter, already disked after harvest, lay quiet on the sheltered side. On the unprotected north section, beyond the wall's influence, the same stubble was moving in the wind, the fine particles of dried stem and exposed soil lifting from the surface in the thin brown haze that meant erosion was happening right now in real time, while Dellard stood and watched. On the sheltered side, nothing moved. He drove home. He did not tell Helen with any particular ceremony. He said the wall was finished, and she said good, and they had supper. He had started the wall with 400 feet in the ground and an idea that the physics would work the way he believed they would work. He finished it with 10,000 stones placed by hand, 5 years and 9 months of pre-dawn and post-sunset work, and the quiet certainty of a man who has been watching the evidence accumulate for 4 growing seasons and knows what the first complete season is going to show. Now let me tell you about what the wall revealed in its first full growing season, because this is where everything Dellard had believed about mass and energy and the behavior of wind against stone received its confirmation. The spring of 1968 came to Hamilton County in the usual way, dry through March and wet in April, and warm enough by the first week of May that the wheat that had been dormant through the winter was growing visibly every day. Dellard planted his west quarter in wheat the same way he had always planted it, same seed variety, same seeding rate, same fertilizer application, same irrigation schedule. The only thing different was the wall. By the end of May, the difference was visible from the county road. Not a subtle difference, not the 2-inch height advantage that Dellard had measured along the first 400 feet in 1963. A difference that you could see from a moving vehicle at highway speed that required no measurement and no specialist knowledge to interpret that, was as clear as the difference between a field that had what it needed and a field that did not. Roger Voss drove past the Pruin farm on the last Thursday in May on his way to another appointment. He slowed. He stopped. He sat in his county truck on the shoulder of the road and looked at what was growing on the west quarter of the Pruin farm for several minutes. Then he turned onto the farm lane and drove to the house. He found Dellard at the equipment shed doing maintenance on the combine which would be needed in 6 weeks. Roger walked to the edge of the wheat field and stood at the boundary between the protected section behind the wall and the unprotected section to the north. He looked at the plants on both sides of the line. He walked into the protected section and stood among the plants. They were taller than anything growing in the unprotected section by several inches. The stand was denser, more uniform. The color was the darker green of a plant that has what it needs at the root level, rather than the slightly yellow green of a plant under moisture stress. Roger turned and walked to the wall. He stood on the upwind side. The wind was running at about 25 miles per hour steady out of the west-southwest. He put his hand up. He felt the full force of it, 25 miles per hour of dry high plains air pushing against his palm. He walked around to the east face of the wall. He put his hand up again. He was not a dramatic man. He was an extension agent trained to assess and report rather than to perform. But he stood with his hand up on the sheltered side of Dellard's wall for a long moment and felt the difference, and the difference was not subtle. He could barely detect the wind at all. He walked back to where Dellard was standing at the field edge. "What am I looking at?" Roger said. 38 bushels, Dellard said. "Maybe 39 when we harvest." Roger looked at him. Then he looked at the field. Then he looked at the wall. "Your west quarter has never done more than 23 bushels," Roger said. "No," Dellard said. "It has never had a wall before." Roger walked to the wall and stood beside it with the expression of a man revising something he has held for a long time. He had been the extension agent for this county for more than a decade. He had been recommending tree shelter belts to Hamilton County farmers for all of those years, and he had been right to recommend them, and he was right that trees were the standard practice for a reason. But he was also looking at a wheat field that was outperforming the county average on ground that had been the worst producing land in the western part of the county for 16 years, and the only thing that had changed was the wall. A 4-foot wall should reduce wind speed for a distance of 10 to 15 times its height on the downwind side, Roger said. 4 feet times 15 is 60 feet. But you are seeing effects much farther than that. It is not just the height, Dellard said. It is the mass. He bent down and picked up a stone from the loose material at the base of the wall, a flat piece of limestone about the size of a dinner plate. "This wall weighs something like 150 tons, he said. "When the wind hits it, the energy has to go somewhere. Some goes over the top, some goes around the ends, but a lot of it goes into the wall, into the gaps between the stones. The wind enters the gaps and bounces around inside the structure and loses its energy to friction. By the time it comes out the other side, it is not wind anymore." He set the stone down. "It is air, and air does not move topsoil." Roger looked at the stone. He looked at the wall. He looked at the field on the sheltered side. He was thinking like a scientist now, not like an extension agent with a recommended practice to defend. He was thinking about the physics of what Dellard was describing about the difference between a solid surface that deflects wind and a porous surface that absorbs it, about mass and friction and energy dissipation. He was thinking about why it had not occurred to him. "Where did you learn that?" Roger asked. "I did not learn it," Dellard said. "I watched it. I watched wind hit this wall for 6 years. The first year, 400 feet of wall, I could see the dust patterns change on the downwind side. By the third year, I could see the soil color change darker on the wall side because the topsoil was staying put instead of blowing. By the 5th year, I could see it in the crop." He looked at the field. "I did not know what it would do before I built it. I had an idea based on what I had watched for 16 years on this farm. Buildings, bins, fence posts. Every solid object has a calm zone behind it. The heavier the object, the larger the calm zone. I just made a very heavy object that was also very long." Roger stood at the edge of the field for a while. Then he took out his notebook and wrote something in it. The notation was not this time not a recognized practice, not recommended. What he wrote was yield data, the numbers Dellard had told him, and a note that he would return for a full conversation after harvest, and that he needed to bring his soil moisture probe. He drove away, and Dellard went back to the equipment shed and his combine maintenance, and the wheat on the west quarter of his farm continued to grow in the shelter of a wall that had taken 6 years and 10,000 stones to build. and the wind that had been removing his topsoil for 16 years moved over the top of that wall and around the ends and dissipated its energy in the gaps between 10,000 pieces of limestone and flint and sandstone and granite, and on the east side of the wall, the side where the wheat was growing, the air was quiet. The harvest of 1968 confirmed what the May wheat had promised: 39 bushels per acre on the west quarter of the Pruin farm. The ground that had been averaging 21 bushels for 16 years. The ground that everyone in Hamilton County had accepted as Dellard Pruin's burden. The ground that sat in the worst wind position in the county, and had been paying the price for that position since the day the native sod was first broken, produced 39 bushels per acre in the first full growing season behind a completed stone wall. The county average that year was 36. Dellard's worst field had become better than average, not by a little. By 3 bushels per acre on ground that had been running 15 bushels below average for the previous decade. He harvested the west quarter the same way he harvested everything else, with the same combine and the same attention to the work, tracking the yield monitor across the field in the systematic pattern he had been using for years. When the last load was in the bin and he had done the arithmetic on his scale tickets, he sat in the combine cab for a few minutes before driving it back to the shed. He was not thinking about Burl Haxton. He was not thinking about Roger Voss or the County Extension Service or the Soil Conservation Service in Washington. He was thinking about his father-in-law who had broken this ground 50 years ago and who had farmed it for decades in the full knowledge that the west quarter was the difficult ground, the problematic ground, the ground that the wind got to first and hardest, and who had accepted that as a fixed condition of the operation. The condition had been fixed. Not by technology, not by a government program, not by anything that required a loan or a salesman or a specialist from the state university. By 150 tons of stone that had been sitting on the surface of that same ground for decades, pushed up by the frost every winter, picked up and thrown away every spring, treated as the farm's primary inconvenience rather than its primary resource. He drove the combine back to the shed. Now let me tell you about what Roger Voss found when he came back that fall, because Roger's visit after the harvest was the beginning of the wall's story beyond the Pruin farm. Roger returned in September with his soil moisture probe and his notebook, and the particular focus of a man who has been thinking about something since May, and has come to do the careful work of determining whether what he observed in spring was real and reproducible or an artifact of a single favorable season. He spent most of a morning at the farm. He took soil moisture readings at 10-foot intervals across the west quarter, starting at the wall and moving east across the full width of the field. He took temperature readings at the soil surface. He measured the height of the wheat stubble, which had already been disked but was still visible as an indicator of the height the living wheat had reached. He noted the distribution of the standing residue, which told him about the uniformity of the stand. Then he went to the section of the west quarter beyond the wall's influence, the northern portion that had not yet had the benefit of a completed wall at the time of this season's growing period, and took the same measurements. The soil moisture differential was significant. The protected zone in the 40 feet immediately behind the wall showed moisture retention 15 to 20% higher than the unprotected zone at the same depth. Further from the wall, the differential diminished, but it was still measurable at distances up to 180 feet downwind. He wrote all of this in his notebook. Then he sat in his truck for a while before driving back to the county office in Syracuse. What he had seen was not what he had expected to see when Dellard first described his plan in the spring of 1962. He had expected to see a pile of rocks that a stubborn farmer had spent 6 years building for no practical result, or at best a mild improvement in a limited zone immediately behind the wall. He had expected to be in the position of explaining gently to Dellard that the wall had not produced what he hoped. Instead, he was in the position of explaining to himself why a man with no engineering training and no research literature to draw on had built something that was doing things that should not have been possible from a 4-foot structure in a county where the wind ran at 25 miles per hour for 120 days a year. The answer, when he worked it out carefully during the drive back to Syracuse, was what Dellard had told him at the wall in May. It was the mass, the porosity, the way the wind entered the structure rather than being deflected by it, and lost its energy inside the stone, rather than reattaching to the ground on the downwind side in the turbulent eddies that solid fences and buildings created. He had been recommending tree shelter belts for a decade based on their height. He had been thinking about the wind problem as a height problem, and the research literature supported that framework. You needed height to redirect the wind above the field surface. You needed 20 feet of conifer, mature and dense, to create the protected zone that a field required. But height was only one mechanism. Mass was another. A 4-foot wall of 150 tons of stone was not doing what a 20-foot tree row did. It was doing something different. It was absorbing rather than deflecting. It was converting kinetic energy to friction heat inside the stone matrix, rather than lifting the wind above the field surface. The effect extended farther downwind than the height formula predicted because the mechanism was different. Roger wrote a bulletin. It took him about a year. He published it in 1973 under the title Stone Windbreaks in Western Kansas, an alternative to traditional shelter belts. The bulletin included the yield data from Dellard's farm going back to 1968, the soil moisture measurements he had taken, the wind speed observations he had made on both sides of the wall, and a construction guide based on the technique Dellard had developed over 6 years of building alone. It was the first official document in the history of Kansas Extension Service publications to recommend stone wall construction as a soil conservation practice in the western part of the state. The Soil Conservation Service read it. In the spring of 1974, an SCS field officer named Gerald Swick drove to Hamilton County from the regional office in Dodge City. He spent 3 days at the Pruin farm with instruments that Roger Voss did not have: a cup anemometer for precise wind speed measurement at different heights and distances, a portable soil erosion trap that measured the amount of soil material moving across a line over a given time period, and a soil core sampler for taking measurements of topsoil depth. He measured wind speed at the wall face on the upwind side and at intervals of 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 150, and 200 feet on the downwind side. He measured soil erosion rates on both sides. He took soil cores at 20-foot intervals across the entire west quarter and compared the topsoil depth readings to the county baseline measurements that the SCS had been maintaining since 1950. His report, which was filed with the regional SCS office in October of 1974 and later submitted to the federal SCS research program in Washington, contained findings that confirmed what Dellard had been observing with his own measurements for 6 years. The wall reduced wind speed by 60 to 75% for a distance of up to 200 feet on the downwind side. Soil erosion loss behind the wall was essentially zero. The unprotected sections of comparable fields in the county were losing an average of 2 tons of soil per acre per year. 2 tons per acre per year. On 320 acres, that was 640 tons of topsoil leaving Hamilton County every year from farms without wind protection. Over the 30 years since the native sod had been broken on most of that ground, the unprotected fields had lost the equivalent of decades of agricultural productivity to a wind that never stopped. Behind Dillard's wall, the topsoil was not thinner than it had been in 1962. It was thicker. The soil core measurements showed that the west quarter had gained just under an inch of effective topsoil depth in the 12 years since the wall was completed, primarily through the accumulation of wind-deposited organic material that the wall captured and retained in the protected zone rather than letting it pass through and blow east to Oklahoma. An inch of topsoil gained, while the surrounding unprotected fields continued to lose. Gerald Swick asked Dellard how he had understood that the wall would work before he built it. Dellard said what he had told Roger Voss 6 years earlier about the barn and the grain bin and the calm zone on the downwind side of every solid object on the farm. He said it differently this time with more precision because he had had 6 more years to observe the wall and to refine his understanding of what it was doing. He said that the key insight was not height but mass, that the standard thinking about windbreaks was based on height because the standard windbreak was a tree, and the thing a tree did was redirect the wind over the top of the field by being taller than the wind's turbulent boundary layer. The thing the wall did was different. It was porous. It did not redirect the wind. It ate the wind. The wind entered the gaps between the stones and lost its energy to friction on the stone surfaces, and what came out the other side was still air but slower air, and slower air did not carry topsoil. Gerald wrote this down. He included it in his report attributed to Dellard Pruin by name. The report was cited in 3 subsequent SCS publications on prairie wind erosion management. A farmer in Hamilton County, Kansas, with no formal education beyond high school and no particular standing in any scientific community was cited by name in 3 federal soil conservation documents as the source of an observation about wind erosion mechanics that the professional research community had not documented in the Great Plains context. Dellard did not know about the citations until years later when Roger showed him. He did not have a strong reaction to the information. He said that was fine and went back to what he had been doing. Now let me tell you about the afternoon in 1970 when Burl Haxton came to the farm, because this is the moment the story has been building toward since 1962, and it arrived not with drama, but with the particular quiet of a man coming to terms with something he has been avoiding for a long time. It was a Tuesday in late summer a few weeks before the start of harvest. Burl had a service call south of Syracuse and had driven the county road past the Pruin farm the way he had driven it dozens of times since Dellard started building in 1962. He had driven past when the wall was 400 feet. He had driven past when it was 1,500 feet, then 2,400, then the full half mile. He had driven past in February of 1964, when the storm brought 30 feet of it down, and he had not stopped, and that moment had stayed with him in the way that moments stay with people when they represent a choice they are not proud of having made. He had driven past the completed wall in the summer of 1968 and seen the difference in the wheat, and he had driven past the same difference in 1969, and it was no longer possible to attribute what he was seeing to soil variation or irrigation schedule or seed variety because he had been buying agricultural supplies for Hamilton County farmers for long enough to know the details of every operation in the county, and he knew that Dellard was not doing anything differently on the protected section than on the unprotected section, except that one of them had a wall in front of it. The wall was working. He had known this in the way that honest people know things they are not yet ready to say out loud since sometime in 1969. He had stopped making the Rockman jokes before the end of that year, which was not the same as saying the wall was working, but which was the beginning of the process of arriving at the point where he could say it. He pulled into the Pruin Farm Lane on that Tuesday afternoon and drove down to the equipment shed where he had seen Dellard's truck parked from the road. Dellard was sharpening a cultivator blade on the bench grinder when Burl walked in. He looked up and then went back to the work he was doing. The two men had not exchanged more than the minimum courtesy of a small county for the better part of 8 years. Burl stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shed and at Dellard and at the wall visible on the western horizon through the shed's open door. Then he said the thing he had driven to the farm to say. "That wall," he said. "It is working." Dellard shut off the grinder. He set the cultivator blade on the bench and looked at Burl. "Has been for 3 years," he said. Burl looked at the wall through the door. Then he looked at the floor of the shed. His face had the expression of a man performing an honest internal accounting, and the accounting was coming out in a way that required him to revise something he had held for a long time. "Your wheat looks different from everyone else's," Burl said. "It is different," Dellard said. "It has got topsoil under it. That is the whole difference." Burl was quiet for a moment. "I called it medieval," he said. "I said you were going back to the Stone Age." "You did." Dellard said it without heat. He was not holding a debt that needed to be paid. He was stating a fact the same way he stated agricultural facts plainly, and without the emotional charge that would have meant something to him about the transaction, rather than about the subject. "I was wrong," Burl said. "You were." Burl looked at the wall through the open shed door for a moment longer. "How much would it cost?" he said. "To build one on my brother's place. He is losing ground on his west quarter, same as you were." Dellard looked at him. "How many rocks has your brother got on his place?" Burl thought about it. "Plenty," he said. "He pulls them every spring, same as everybody does." "Then it costs nothing but time," Dellard said. "The rocks are free. The labor is his own. He can take rocks from anywhere in the county. Every farmer I know was glad to have me haul their rocks away. Saves them the trip to the gravel pit." "How long did it take you?" Burl said. 6 years working alone," Dellard said. "2 men working together could probably do it in 3. He picked up the cultivator blade and looked at the edge he had been sharpening. "Tell your brother to come by if he wants to walk the wall," he said. "I will show him how the stones fit together." Burl stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he put his hat on and walked to his truck and drove away. He did not say he was sorry. He did not have a speech prepared about being wrong publicly in front of the co-op crowd. Dellard did not want that, and would not have been comfortable with it, and Burl was perceptive enough to understand that the exchange they had just had was the right size and shape for what it was. The following spring, a stone wall began going up along the western boundary of Burl Haxton's brother's farm 3 miles north of the Pruin place. It was built by Burl's brother and Burl himself on weekends and evenings using stones from the brothers' field piles and from 3 neighboring farms whose owners were glad to see the rocks removed. The spring after that, another wall started on a farm east of Syracuse. By 1975, there were 7 stone walls running along western fence lines in Hamilton County. Dellard had not built any of them. The farmers who built them had come to his farm to walk his wall and understand the construction, and had gone home to do the same thing on their own boundaries with their own stones. Roger Voss had already published his bulletin by then, which provided the technical framework and the yield data, but the actual transmission of the knowledge traveled the way agricultural knowledge in a farming community almost always travels, not through official publications, but through farmers talking to farmers on the basis of what they had seen with their own eyes. Let me tell you about the 4 things the wall did that Dellard had not planned, because these are as important as the thing he had planned, and they reveal something about the relationship between a careful intention and the unplanned consequences of acting carefully over time. The first was the topsoil accumulation. Dellard had built the wall to prevent topsoil loss. He had understood it as a conservation measure, a way to hold what was there. What happened was different from holding. The wall did not simply prevent the topsoil from leaving. It created conditions that allowed topsoil to accumulate. The protected zone behind the wall was calm enough that wind carried organic material, the fine particles of decayed plant matter and humus that the wind picks up from unprotected fields across the county and carries east, settled out of the air in the sheltered section rather than continuing downwind. Dellard's field became a collector of material that other fields were losing. After a decade, the topsoil in the protected zone was measurably deeper than it had been when the wall was finished. This was not what he had designed for. He had designed for zero loss. He got gain. The second was moisture conservation. He had understood from watching the calm zone behind his barn that the sheltered area would have less surface evaporation than exposed ground. Less wind meant slower evaporation from the soil surface, which meant more water available to the crop roots during the growing season. What he had not anticipated was the magnitude. In dry years, which in Hamilton County meant most years, the moisture differential between the protected zone and the unprotected zone was the difference between a stress event and no stress event during the critical grain fill period. This was not a minor yield factor. This was the factor that determined whether a drought year was a bad year or a crop failure year. The wall did not make it rain. It made the rain that fell count for more. The third was the snow. He had not thought about snow at all when he was building. He was thinking about summer wind and summer soil loss and summer crop stress. What he discovered in the first winters after the wall was completed was that the wall worked as a snow fence. Drifts accumulated on the east face in the sheltered zone, and when the drifts melted in spring, the meltwater soaked into the soil rather than running off frozen ground. This was free irrigation. In a county that averaged 17 inches of rainfall per year, the equivalent of an additional 2 to 4 inches of moisture delivered to the root zone in the form of snowmelt was not a marginal benefit. It was sometimes the difference between the crop making and not making. The fourth was the habitat, and this was the one that nobody expected, including Dellard. The gaps between the stones became occupied, not by pests, not by the mice and insects that a farmer might dread, but by the organisms that function as a farming operation's unacknowledged workforce. Beneficial insects found the wall's south-facing gaps in summer. Drawn by the heat, the dark stone absorbed and held. Spiders colonized the lower courses and built webs that spanned the spaces between stones. Ground beetles which prey on crop pest larvae in the soil moved into the wall base and used it as daytime shelter while foraging the field at night. The hawks and kestrels came for the mice, which had come for the seeds that accumulated in the wall base, and the hawks and kestrels were not selective. They hunted grasshoppers from the wall's top course and took field mice from the surrounding area and generally reduced the pest pressure on the ground within a quarter-mile of the structure. Dellard noticed the birds first because they were the most visible. He started seeing a kestrel sitting on the wall's top course in the mornings, and he noticed that the grasshopper pressure on the wheat rows near the wall was lower than it was farther away, and he made the connection the way he made all agricultural connections by watching over time and asking what was different on one side of the line versus the other. What was different was the wall. The wall had brought the kestrel. The kestrel was eating grasshoppers. Fewer grasshoppers meant better yield. He had built a wall to stop the wind. The wall had stopped the wind and then created a miniature ecosystem along its length, a strip of habitat running half a mile down the western edge of his farm that was doing ecological work he had not designed and had not paid for and had not anticipated. This was what he told Gerald Swick from the SCS in the fall of 1974. When Gerald asked him to describe all of the effects he had observed, he described the topsoil accumulation, the moisture conservation, the snow capture, and the habitat development with the same methodical precision he brought to everything about the farm. He described them as observed facts, not as arguments, because they were observed facts and arguments were not his method. Gerald included all four in his report. The report noted that the secondary benefits of the Pruin stone wall exceeded the primary intended benefit of wind erosion reduction in their cumulative agricultural value over a decade of observation. Gerald asked Dellard at the end of his 3-day visit how he had known at the beginning that the wall would work. Dellard's answer was the same answer he had given Roger 6 years earlier about the barn and the grain bin and the calm zones and the relationship between mass and wind energy. But he said one additional thing to Gerald that he had not said to Roger. He said that he had not known the wall would work before he built it. He had guessed. He had made an educated guess based on 16 years of watching wind behave around vertical objects on his farm. And he had built something based on that guess, and the guess had turned out to be correct. But the educated part of the guess was less important than the building part. If you have an idea that might work and you do not build it, you have nothing. If you have an idea that might work and you build it for 6 years alone while the county laughs, you might have something. The only way to know is to build it. Gerald included that in the report too. It was the passage from the Pruin report that was most widely cited in subsequent SCS publications, more widely cited than the wind speed data or the soil erosion measurements or any of the technical findings. Different problem, different definition of useful. That was the quote. It came from the part of the conversation where Dellard was explaining why fieldstones, which were universally considered a waste material and a farming nuisance, were the right material for the wall. They were useless for plowing. They were worse than useless for combining. They were the thing you spent effort removing every spring specifically because they impeded every other agricultural operation on the farm. But stopping wind did not require a plow-friendly surface. It did not require any of the properties that made a material useful for conventional farming. It required mass and surface area and the ability to be stacked 4 feet high without mortar. Fieldstones had all three properties in abundance. The stone that was trash for farming was ideal for wind stopping. The same object, different problem, different definition of useful. Now let me tell you about the years that followed and about Owen Pruin and about what it means for a wall to outlast the man who built it. Dellard farmed until 1992. He was 74 years old that year, the same age at which his body began telling him what bodies tell farmers at that age. that the scale of the work needed to adjust to accommodate what remained of the capacity rather than the capacity adjusting to accommodate the scale of the work. Owen Pruin was in his 40s and had been working alongside his father since he was old enough to drive equipment, and the transition of the farm from father to son was the kind of transition that works best, gradual and collaborative, and based on shared knowledge rather than formal transfer. Owen had grown up with the wall the way you grow up with the permanent features of your landscape as a fixed part of the world rather than as a decision that someone made. He had been young enough when the building was finished that the wall had always been there in his conscious memory, and he had not fully understood what it had meant for his father to build it until he was old enough to understand what 6 years of daily work at 4 in the morning and after dark in the evening actually cost a man who also had a farm to run. He walked the wall with his father every October in the years after the harvest, the two of them going over the structure section by section the way Dellard had been doing it alone since 1962. Owen learned what to look for, which stones settled in patterns that needed correction, where the frost had worked on specific sections in ways that required attention before the next winter, how to read the wall the way his father had learned to read it over 30 years of maintenance. After Dellard stepped back from the farm work in 1992, Owen continued the October walks alone. He found the same things Dellard had found and addressed them the same way Dellard had addressed them. The wall had been standing for 25 years by then, and it required less attention each year as the stones settled into their final positions and the structure found its equilibrium with the ground beneath it and the wind against it. In 1995, Owen extended the wall. He extended it north from the section corner at the top of the original half-mile by another quarter-mile following the fence line into the section that the original wall had not reached. The northern section of the farm had never had wind protection. The yields on that section had been consistent with the county average for unprotected ground, which is to say declining as the topsoil continued to thin. Owen built the extension the way Dellard had built the original alone in the mornings and evenings while the farm work ran in parallel. He used stones from the same sources Dellard had used his own fields and the fields of the same neighboring farms that had been glad to have their rocks removed for 30 years. It took him 4 years. When he finished, the wall ran from the county road at the south to a quarter-mile north of the original section corner, 3/4 of a mile total. The extension looked slightly different from the original because Owen's eye for stone placement was not quite his father's eye, but the structure was sound and the function was the same. Dellard came to look at it when it was finished. He was 81 years old, and he walked the length of the extension slowly looking at the stones the way he had looked at everything on that farm for 50 years, with the comprehensive attention of a man who has made himself an expert in a specific set of materials over a long time. He said it was good work. He said the top course needed attention in 2 sections. Owen spent the next Saturday on those sections. Dellard died in 2007. He was 89 years old. The funeral was at the Mennonite Church in Syracuse, the church where he and Helen had attended services for 60 years, and the service was smaller than it might have been if Dellard had been a man who sought prominence, which he was not. He was a man who built things and grew crops, and kept his thoughts mostly to himself, and the circle of people who knew him well enough to come from a distance was not large. Roger Voss came. He was retired by then, past his mid-70s, and he had stayed in the county after his extension service career and had been driving past the Pruin Farms wall for 45 years. He sat in the pew with the quiet attention of a man attending the funeral of someone who had taught him something important. Gerald Swick, the SCS field officer who had spent 3 days at the wall in 1974, drove from Wichita. He was retired as well, and he had told the story of the Pruin Wall to more farmers and extension agents and soil conservation professionals than he could count in the 33 years since his report was published. He drove to Syracuse because he thought it was the right thing to do and because no one else from the federal system would be there to acknowledge what the farm in Hamilton County had contributed to the practice of soil conservation in the Great Plains. Burl Haxton's brother came. He had been farming behind his own stone wall for 30 years by then, and his west quarter was producing yields that had not been possible on that ground in his father's time. He came because the wall on his farm had started because of the man being buried, and the least he could do was be present. Owen spoke at the service. He talked about the farm the way farmers talk about farms when they are speaking at the funeral of the person who made the farm, what it is, with the particular combination of specificity and emotion that comes from a life of shared physical labor on a specific piece of ground. He talked about the cattle and the wheat and the winter maintenance and the particular quality of the mornings in Hamilton County when the light came up flat and clear and you could see 50 miles in every direction. And he talked about the wall. He said one thing about his father that was not a description of what Dellard had built or how he had built it or what it had produced. He said it at the end after the technical history of the wall and the yields and the soil conservation data that the federal government had eventually confirmed after all of the things that could be measured and cited and published. He said, "My father looked at rocks and saw a wall. Everyone else looked at the same rocks and saw trash. That is the difference between a man who solves problems and a man who complains about them. The rocks were always there, the wind was always there. My father just put one in front of the other. The wall that Dellard Pruin built between 1962 and 1967 is still standing in Hamilton County, Kansas. It has been standing for more than 50 years. It has endured every Kansas winter in that half-century, the freeze-thaw cycles and the ice storms and the sustained wind loads of 100 prairie winters. And it has settled into itself in the way that structures settle when they are built correctly, not failing but finding each stone moving incrementally toward the position that satisfies the physics of its situation and then staying there. The stones that were heaved by frost in the early years have settled. The sections that needed rebuilding after the first difficult winters have not needed rebuilding again. The wall has become, in the language of structural systems, a mature structure, one that has worked through its instabilities and arrived at a stable configuration. Owen maintains it. He walks it every October the way his father walked it and the way Dellard's father-in-law walked the fields of that farm before either of them was born, with the systematic attention of someone who understands that the things that last are the things that are tended. Clara Pruin Dellard's granddaughter and Owen's daughter is the third generation. She grew up on the farm the same way Owen grew up on it, with the wall as a permanent fixture of the landscape, a thing that had always been there in her living memory. She went to Kansas State University in Manhattan and studied agronomy, and in her senior year she wrote a paper about her grandfather's wall. The paper was titled "Vernacular Soil Conservation Stone Windbreaks as an Indigenous Response to Wind Erosion in Western Kansas." She had been working on it for 2 semesters, drawing on the SCS report, the Extension Service Bulletin, the yield records Dellard had kept in his notebooks, and her own field measurements taken during trips home from Manhattan on long weekends. Her thesis advisor was a professor of agronomy who had spent 30 years studying soil conservation practices on the Great Plains. He had published papers on everything from no-till farming to cover crop integration to precision irrigation management. He had seen most of what could be done with agricultural land in a semi-arid environment. He read Clara's paper over a long weekend. When she came to his office for her advising session, he had one change to suggest. He crossed out the word vernacular in the title with his pen. He looked at her over his glasses. He wrote a different word above it. Brilliant. Clara drove home that weekend and found Owen in the barn doing the same maintenance work that Dellard had been doing in the same barn when Roger Voss first came to look at the wall in May of 1968. She showed him the paper with the professor's annotation. Owen looked at it for a moment. Then he looked out the barn door at the wall on the western horizon, the gray line of stone running north from the county road in the late afternoon light. Your grandfather would have read every word of it, he said. He would not have understood some of the terminology, but he would have read every word. He handed the paper back. She brought it home the following spring when she graduated, and Owen cleared a space for it on the desk in the barn office where Dellard had kept his notebooks. The desk where 30 years of yield records and soil moisture readings and the careful arithmetic of a man who trusted numbers more than opinions had been assembled over the course of a farming life. The paper sat next to the notebooks on the desk, the scientific documentation of something that had been known on that farm since 1968, since the first full season behind the complete wall, when the west quarter of the Pruin farm had produced 39 bushels of wheat on ground that had been averaging 21. Every spring in Hamilton County, the freeze-thaw cycle pushes new stones to the surface of the fields around the wall. Clara picks them up the same way Dellard picked them up, the same way Owen picked them up, the same way every farmer in the county has been picking them up for 100 years. She adds them to the wall. Not because the wall needs them, though. There are always sections that benefit from additional material on the top course and sections where the winter has created small gaps in the face that a flat stone placed correctly will close. She adds them because the wall taught her family something that is easy to say and hard to live, which is that nothing the land gives you is waste, not if you know what to do with it. The stones that break plow blades are not the enemy, they are the material. The wind that removes topsoil is not just a force to be endured. It is a problem with a solution, and the solution was sitting in a pile at the corner of the fence line all along, pushed to the surface by the same frost that made the winter difficult, waiting for someone to understand that the problem and the answer had been occupying the same field for 50 years without anyone seeing the connection. Dellard Pruin saw it. He was not a scientist. He had no degree and no grant and no institutional affiliation. He had a farm that was losing ground and a pile of rocks and the willingness to spend 6 years building something alone that everyone around him called a waste of time. He stopped the wind. He built back the topsoil. He created a system that renewed itself every year as the same wind that had been his enemy became the mechanism that delivered new fertility to his field in the form of the organic material it had stolen from everyone else. Sometimes the answer to a force of nature is not technology. Sometimes it is geology. The wind is the problem. The rocks are the answer. And patience is the tool that connects them. The wall is still standing. The wheat behind it still outperforms the county average. The topsoil is still dark and still deep and still holding moisture in a county where most fields have lost half their original topsoil depth over the past 100 years of cultivation. And every spring when the frost pushes new stones to the surface of the fields around the Pruin farm, Clara Pruin picks them up the same way her grandfather did, carries them to the wall, and adds them to a structure that has been absorbing the wind and protecting the soil since 1967. Not because the wall is finished, not because it needs the stones, because nothing the land gives you is waste.